Hello and welcome to the Pilgrim Way. My name is Norman Graham and I'm a minister in the Baptist Union of Churches in Scotland. The aim of these signposts is to try to help to connect the text of the Bible with our everyday lives. Today's signpost is based on the book of Ruth and Ruth Chapter 1. I'm going to read that now. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land. So a man from Bethlehem in Judah, together with his wife and 2 sons, went to live for a while in the country of Moab. The man's name was Elimelech, his wife's name was Naomi, and the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion, and they were Ephrathites from Bethlehem, Judah, and they went to Moab and lived there. Now Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. They married Moabite women, one named Orpah and the other Ruth. And after they had lived there about 10 years, both Mahlon and Chilion also died, and Naomi was left without her two sons and her husband. When Naomi heard in Moab that the Lord had come to the aid of his people by providing food for them, she and her daughters-in-law prepared to return home from there. With her 2 daughters-in-law, she left the place where she'd been living and set out on the road that would take them back to the land of Judah. Then Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, "Go back, each of you, to your mother's home. May the Lord show you kindness as you have shown kindness to your dead husbands and to me. May the Lord grant that each of you will find rest in the home of another husband." Then she kissed them goodbye, and they wept aloud and said to her, "We will go back with you to your people." Excuse me. But Naomi said, "Return home, my daughters. Why would you come with me? Am I going to have any more sons who could become your husbands? Return home, my daughters. I am too old to have another husband. Even if I thought there was still hope for me, even if I had a husband tonight and gave birth to sons, would you wait until they grew up? Would you remain unmarried for them? No, my daughters. It is more bitter for me than for you, because the Lord's hand has turned against me." At this they wept aloud again. Then Orpah kissed her mother-in-law goodbye, but Ruth clung to her. "Look," said Naomi, "your sister-in-law is going back to her people and her gods. Go back with her." But Ruth replied, "Don't urge me to leave you or to turn back from you. Where you go, I will go, and where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if even death separates you and me." When Naomi realized that Ruth was determined to go with her, she stopped urging her. So the 2 women went on until they came to Bethlehem. When they arrived in Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred because of them, and the women exclaimed, "Can this be Naomi?" "Don't call me Naomi," she told them. "Call me Mara, because the Lord Almighty has made my life very bitter. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi? The Lord has afflicted me, the Almighty has brought misfortune upon me." So Naomi returned from Moab, accompanied by Ruth the Moabite, her daughter-in-law, arriving in Bethlehem as the barley harvest was beginning. Well, a few years ago I was browsing in a bookshop and I came across a photography book, but it was an unusual photography book. The author had toured the United States of America by visiting churches and photographing their notice boards. And some of the notice boards were really very corny, like the one that said, "Tweet others as you would like to be tweeted." Yeah, really. However, many of them were absolutely hilarious, although they probably weren't meaning to be. My favourite was the one that said, "Don't let your worries kill you, let the church help." I'm sure it was well intentioned, but, well, it's kind of obvious, isn't it? The aim of a church notice board is to try and give you a sense of what kind of church it is and what might be going on inside the building. The first verse of the book of Ruth is kind of like that. It's not just a complete story by itself, it's a story within a story. For we learn in verse 1 that the events it describes occurred in the days when the judges ruled. The reference to the time of Judges places Ruth in a particular historical, social and political and religious context. And that context is really crucial to Ruth's story, because it gives us an appreciation for the godliness of the main characters, and it highlights the gracious providence of God in the lives of Naomi, Ruth and Boaz, the main characters in the book. Charles Dickens' novel A Tale of Two Cities begins with the famous words, "It was the best of times, it was the worst of times." And those words are really an appropriate description of the period covered by the book of Ruth. The days of the Judges were characterised by international international as well as national political turmoil, where no one nation dominated the region. It was also a time of lawlessness, as the people of Israel abandoned their commitment to God. In short, it was a time of political, social, moral and religious anarchy. In fact, Judges 17 verse 6 sums up the whole period when it says that in those days there was no king in Israel and everyone did what was right in their own eyes, or as they saw fit. In ancient times, the king represented the idea of justice, but there was little justice, if any, in the land at that time. It was a particularly bad time for poor, ordinary folk who lacked power and authority, and it's striking that later in the story, Boaz instructs his workers not to touch Ruth or bother her as she gleans in the field. The inference is that she was at risk of sexual assault, and so by protecting her, Boaz stands in contrast to the moral norms of his day. It doesn't take a great leap of imagination to think that the social setting of Ruth's story is a direct echo of our own social setting. Although there is indeed a king in the land today, that king is just really a figurehead, a remnant of a bygone age with no real judicial power or authority. The present age is described by sociologists and philosophers as being characterised by a rejection of absolutes, particularly the idea of absolute truth or authority. In other words, something is only right or wrong if you believe it to be right or wrong, and your beliefs and your truth have no more authority or relevance, or less even, than anyone else's, even when those beliefs are contradictory, or indeed contrary to all reason and scientific facts. We too live in an age when, in a sense, everyone does what is right in their own eyes. And a key aspect of that rejection of the so-called old moral order, an order that in the West at least was largely founded on the idea that there is a God who instructs us how we ought to live and who holds us accountable for our actions. Unfortunately, the approach of doing as you see fit didn't work very well in the time of Judges, and it's not working very well in the 21st century either. Political corruption, consumerist greed, and do unto others before they can do unto you attitude are the hallmarks of our society. Everyone's out in it for themselves. The book of Judges is perhaps a warning from history for us, as it ends very pessimistically, as it describes a society very much like ours that is rotten to the core and hastening its own destruction. We might imagine that things will just continue on as they are now, but history teaches us that all civilizations eventually collapse under the weight of their own evils. If the book of Judges is a warning from history for us, then perhaps the book of Ruth sounds a note of hope, that despite the way things are now, there are indeed better days to come. But the path to those better days is unlikely to be the path that we expect. In Isaiah 55, God says, "My thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways. As the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts." God's ways of working in our lives and in human experience and history are mysterious, but when we reflect on them, we must hold together two important truths: that God is sovereign and that God is good. The sovereignty of God is often understood to mean that everything that happens in our lives is God's will. He's in direct control of all of it. but that's not actually correct. Biblically speaking, to say that God is sovereign is to say that he is the supreme and ultimate power and authority. He has no equal in all of creation. However, not everything that happens in our lives is God's will. God does not will that we sin, and yet we do sin. Even the Apostle Paul lamented that he didn't do the thing that he did want to do, and he ended up doing the very thing that he didn't want to do. Sin is a real power in the world, and we often fall prey to it. So it's something of a paradox to affirm that we do things contrary to the will of God, and also to affirm that everything that happens in our lives remains within the scope of God's sovereign power and grace. How does that work? Well, in Romans 8, Paul famously writes of God working all things together for good, for our good. What that means is that he will take even our sins, sorrows, heartaches and tragedies and mould them together into his purposes for us for our ultimate good. And the book of Ruth demonstrates this truth. Through suffering and hardship, faith and endurance, Naomi and Ruth journeyed from sorrow to joy, famine to fullness, and participated in God's redemptive plan, leading to the birth of the grandfather of King David, the ancestor of Jesus, the Messiah. I guess you can say that the book of Ruth is a case study of the text of Ecclesiastes 3 and 11 that says he has made everything beautiful in its time. In fact, that text could indeed be a summary of the book of Ruth. God will not waste even one of our tears or allow our suffering to be pointless and without purpose, because he's not just sovereign, he is good. To only hold to one of these two truths about God will inevitably lead to a distorted view of God and of life itself. If we believe that God is sovereign without believing that he's good, then God will appear to be cruel and capricious like the gods of Greek mythology. If we believe that God is good but not sovereign, then God will seem powerless to do anything about our suffering and our sorrows. And yet the Bible repeatedly affirms both the sovereignty of God and the goodness of God. To say that God is both sovereign and good means that, as Paul says in Romans 8, he will work all things together for our good, according to his purposes. But that does not mean that all things that happen to us are good. The famine in Bethlehem was not good. The death of Naomi's husband and sons was not good. The barrenness of Orpah and Ruth was not good. But God, in his sovereign goodness, through his invisible hand of providence, brought good from those tragic events. Naomi stands in a long line of biblical figures who suffer through no fault of their own. Joseph, Joshua, Hannah, David, Jeremiah and Ezekiel, to name but a few. Naomi is the female equivalent of Job, who sees the hand of God in both her affliction and in her deliverance. And through a painful journey, she finds a deeper faith in God, all because she learns that God is both sovereign and good. The story of Ruth moves from death to life, barrenness to fruitfulness, emptiness to fullness, curse to blessing. But it does so in very unexpected ways, for the hand of God in it all is hidden from everyone involved in the story. The story has no miracles at all. It does have a lot of coincidences though. There are no inspired prophetic assurances, no word from God to assure them, don't worry, it's all going to work out fine in the end. It's also not a big story, it's a very domestic and intensely personal story, and God's actions in the lives of Naomi, Ruth and Boaz lie hidden beneath the surface, not on it for all to see. What this tells us is that the story of salvation is ongoing even in the worst of times and experiences. It is being advanced just as much when miracles are absent as when they are present. It teaches us that whilst God saves by signs and wonders as he did in the Exodus, he also saves by his hidden and providential grace and goodness in our everyday lives. Now you might be thinking, well, the story of Ruth and Naomi ended well, but mine has not. But the story of our lives is not yet over. It is still being told. God has not finished with us yet, and he is still at work, most likely in ways that we cannot yet see or understand. At the time Naomi was going through all of these hardships, she didn't know how her story would end. She only knew or thought that the hand of the Lord had afflicted her. Don't call me Naomi, call me Mara. Mara means bitter. And she saw that as all the hand of God against her. Yet in the end, her story powerfully reminds us that our struggles are real and that we can be honest about the state of our hearts. Her full story reminds us that our struggles are also important to God, and that even when there's nothing left but rubble, God is mysteriously at work in the mess. There is something else this story teaches us though. For all these events happen, as I say, in the context of the time of the Judges. A time when everyone did what was right in their own eyes. A phrase that's often linked to the fact that in those days there was no king in Israel. It's as though the writer of Judges sees the monarchy as a solution to the anarchy that prevails in the absence of a king. So the final part of Judges in particular prepares the people for the kingship in Israel. But along with 1 Samuel, which follows on from Ruth, it hints that not just any king will do. The answer to moral chaos is the right kind of king, God's choice. Ruth's story takes place in a time of anarchy and social collapse, but it closes with the beginning of the royal line of David. In other words, Ruth names the king that the book of Judges is looking for. Ruth is, in a sense, an enacted parable which is designed to show that in the midst of religious, moral and societal collapse, God has not forgotten or withdrawn his redemptive plan. In all the apostasy and degeneracy, God was at work in the least likely circumstances and people to accomplish his purpose. So Ruth gives us hope when all hope seems lost. Unfortunately, although David is described in the Bible as a man after God's own heart, nonetheless 1 and 2 Samuel present him as a very flawed king who didn't fully obey the Lord. In fact, he committed adultery and murder and then engaged in a political cover-up. David was a good shepherd to Israel, but he was not the good shepherd who always cared for the sheep. And so Samuel looks forward to a descendant of David's who would lay down his life for the sheep, his people. And so we have to fast forward through history to another time and another situation when all hope seemed lost, yet where, despite all evidence to the contrary, God was at work fulfilling his redemptive purpose for us. The king of God's choosing would come. He would be the good shepherd who would lay down his life for the sheep, his people. Contrary to human expectation and reason, God took the frailty and vulnerability of human flesh as a baby in the very town where the story of Ruth takes place. Contrary to human expectation and reason, God, through the apparent failure and futility of the cross, took upon himself the sins of the world. Contrary to human expectation and reason, God defeated death in the resurrection of Jesus. Set as it is in the midst of the chaos and anarchy of the time of the Judges, a time, very much like our own, Ruth's story reminds us that God is at work even when there is little or no evidence to that effect. Our society is in a mess politically, economically, morally and spiritually. The church is in catastrophic decline. More people have left the church in America in the last 25 years than were saved through the first Great Awakening, the second Great Awakening, and every crusade of Billy Graham's all put together. And yet, in the midst of all that chaos, anarchy, God is at work, often incognito, often in surprising ways which are not always immediately obvious or apparent to us. Just as in the time of Ruth, he is at work in the lives of ordinary people in ordinary everyday circumstances, fulfilling his purposes for us, working all the events of our lives together. The good events and the hard events, the painful events, working them all together for our good. For God is both sovereign and good, and everything that he does is good and for our good. Naomi, Ruth and Boaz all placed their hope and trust in God despite the circumstances all around them. And if we will do the same, well, who knows how our story will end? In the midst of all the anarchy and chaos and hardship and sorrow and suffering around us, I choose to believe that there will come a day when we will survey our lives, and then we too will acknowledge that he has made everything beautiful in its time. Thanks for listening.